Fabian. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you, Victor?
I'm doing real good. I was able to do some more reading. I was able to read the first 12 issues of your Cable and Deadpool run, which I really enjoyed.
Thank you. So did I.
Okay, let me ask you, because we really didn't get to talk about your X-Men work last time, and again, that was unfortunate. But I wanted to ask you, you started writing X-Men. It was not ideal circumstances, was it?
No, not at all. Actually, I first began working on the X-Men mostly to help out on schedule situations. I think I had a script and issue that had been plotted, and then I had to finish up a storyline. If my bad memory recalls, I think that it was a combination of Chris's schedule being really, really tight for a variety of reasons. Sometimes monthly writer schedules get really, really tight, combined with Chris and the editor were not agreeing on the conclusion of the story. And at that time, you know, at that age, you don't ask too many questions because you may not want to know the answers. I was offered an assignment that the editor said needs to be done because the writer can't do it, and unless the writer is a really close friend of yours or, you know, an office down the hall because you're both working on staff together, you generally don't find out why until several weeks later what the real reason was. So I did the scripting assignment. I did the plotting and completion of the Muir Island storyline. I have to be honest, I don't even remember the exact issues. I think it might have been 279 and 280, something like that.
Yeah. And
then that was it. There was no intention of taking over the book or becoming the writer of the book or anything like that. In fact, I didn't get the X-Men assignment itself until issue 12 of the relaunch of the new book, the second book that they did. So it was a couple of years between or at least a year and a half between that fill-in work and becoming a regular writer of the monthly X-Men book. I do know, I'm almost positive that I was the first person to have his name in the writer's credit in place of Chris on the X-Men title, the Uncanny X-Men title, in something like 10 or 15 years or something like that. Because I think Chris wrote the X-Men for like 17 years consecutively. And I think my issue was the first one that he did not write, which, I got to be honest, it's not that much to be proud of, considering the circumstances, but it is a pretty cool little bit of trivia.
Can you explain, because you were writing so many different books, can you explain the process for writing X-Men when you got to be the regular writer compared to something like writing New Warriors or writing Nomad?
A lot of it really depends on the nature of the book, the nature of your relationship with the editor, and the nature of your relationship with the artist. That really defines how you approach things differently. The X-Men had, like, writing the X-Men was nothing like writing New Warriors, and writing New Warriors was nothing like writing Nomad. They were all very, very different experiences. Part of the way I was able to maintain some semblance of sanity during those few years where I was doing so much work and working a full-time job, it was that the nature of the individual writing assignments were pretty different. X-Force had a tone and a little bit of freedom to it that X-Men did not have. New Warriors had a pretty great alchemy between myself and Mark Bagley, the artist, and then Derek Robertson after that, combined with Danny Fingeroff, my editor. It was a really fun, volatile combination. Danny and I used to argue all the time about everything, but it was always for the betterment of the book. And we disagreed a lot, and Danny's a lot more safe and conservative by nature than I am, and I was younger and much more willing to be aggressive and try to push the envelope, and that combination of me and Danny, combined with Mark and Derek's storytelling, made for a very, very lively book that pushed the edges a bit. If you look at the content of some of those issues from my first 2-3 years in the Warriors, it certainly pushed the edges a little bit for what mainstream Marvel titles were doing, but never enough that it lost sight of the fact that it was a mainstream Marvel Universe superhero book, you know. Conversely, Nomad was developed and crafted from its very, very inception to be a book that would go as far as was humanly possible within the confines of the Comics Code of Authority and Marvel's publishing philosophy at that time. You have to remember there were a lot more younger people reading comics back then. We were distributed on the newsstand for a lot of our titles. There was still far less confidence in allowing mainstream superhero titles to really push the envelope of subject matter the way they do much more easily now. Conversely, nowadays there's no frickin' young readers who are reading comics at all, and there's barely any comics from the mainstream companies that are really good or geared for young readers. So, you know, it's six of one, half dozen of another. So writing Nomad was very different. I got to tell stories about the LA riots and about transvestites and about gambling on Indian casinos and, you know, you name it, I was doing odd different things. I did a whole arc on the HIV virus, which at that time was incredibly raw and new and fresh. You got to remember, it was the early 90s. And in New Warriors, I got to tell stories about teenagers figuring out their way in the world and being anti-corporate and being anti-government, anti-establishment, because they figured they can get away with being that. X-Men was Marvel's #1 selling title. It had a tremendous amount of burden of responsibility on it for what you could or couldn't do. It had an editor who, to this day, is not an editor who really understands or appreciates humor in comics all that much. So the book was never allowed to have real moments of levity or real moments of character interaction. I worked with an artist, Andy Hubert, who I think is a phenomenal artist, but I don't think that humor and character interaction and emotion are his strong suits. I think Andy is a phenomenal artist to put on a book like Thor or Captain America or Fantastic Four, but not necessarily a group dynamic book, or Batman. He was great on Batman. Not a book that requires a panel where two characters are subtly looking at each other in the background while another character speaks in the foreground. You know, that wasn't Andy's forte. And I think a book like the X-Men, when it's been at its best, when Chris was writing it with artists like Dave Cockrum or John Byrne or Paul Smith, even J.R., John Romita Jr., understood how to make the characters act in the book. And as a result, I always felt incredibly stifled and stilted writing the X-Men. It was a very difficult 3 years that I was on the book. I mean, I quit the book. I quit the #1 selling book in the industry because I just simply could not continue to write a book that I was not enjoying writing. The working methodology between myself and Bob and Scott, although we all got along and we were all friends, it wasn't a good, clean, healthy working methodology, because Bob and Scott work far more simpatico than Bob and I did, or than Scott and I do, because I actually like to organize and plan what I'm doing, and they kind of got ADD and they like to just bounce around and let the winds take them where they may. So it was very different. So every month in and month out, I had very, very different relationships with my books, you know? So it made for interesting times.
Okay, in 1999, I believe it was, or it might have been 2000, I'm not sure, you came back to X-Men for a brief storyline, a Magneto storyline. Had things changed at all as far as working on the X-books would go?
No, I was just a scripting assignment. I had nothing to do with the story. I had no input in the story. They asked me if I could script a few issues that Alan Davis was plotting, and I said I would, but I was under no impression nor interest in becoming the X-Men writer. I was actually pretty damn happy in writing Gambit at the time. After I left Acclaim, I started writing for Marvel again pretty soon after leaving Acclaim Entertainment. And Gambit was one of the first assignments I got at Marvel, and I really was enjoying the first year of that book quite a lot with Steve Scroce. and X-Men was just it was just an assignment. Honestly, that's all it was. Scripting those issues was just an assignment. I barely remember the story to this day, and I had very, very little emotional investment in what was going on with the title at that time. I hadn't read X-Men for 5-6 years. Since I had quit the book, I hadn't read the book, so I didn't even know what had been going on. I had really missed the entire Joe Kelly and Steven Seagal tenure. I'd missed the Mark Waid tenure. I had no idea what was going on in the book, so I caught up a little bit because I was writing Gambit, but not that much.
Yeah, I remember enjoying it at the time, but it's been years since I read it. On New Warriors, can you tell me, when did you have the ideal to have Marvel Boy or Justice kill his father?
That was actually part of the original working outline, I'm pretty sure. That when I did a 1-year outline for the book, I also had, and these things are going to happen in year 2, and one of the things I had was that Vance accidentally assaults his father because his father was going to hit him, and he overreacts, and I think I did it as a question mark because I didn't want to set it in concrete, because you never set things in concrete too far in advance for fear that your editor is not going to like it or not going to want to do it, and the idea could stick negatively with them. So by the time you get there, the relationship with your editor may have changed, your confidence with the title may have changed, the title could be a huge success, in which case you got leeway to do a lot more things. So you always put stuff in your proposal when you're doing your outlines for further down the road. You always do it as question marks. So it's like could the assault be lethal with a question mark? You don't say the assault is lethal and the dad dies. You say, what if the assault is lethal with a question mark? That sounds very Stanley to me, and it worked with Danny because I could get away with planning things that he didn't know for sure I was going to try to do, but by the time I got to them, he had confidence that I would handle it okay, and that was one of them. So quite frankly, the first 2 years of New Warriors were pretty well planned when I first proposed the first year of the series. We had a lot of lead time between me making my proposal. It was a bake-off. A lot of people were pitching, and Danny was trying to get what he perceived of as a quote-unquote name writer to write the book. And there was a lot of internal support at the company for me to get the book because they thought I was a writer that was ready to get a monthly superhero book and had an opportunity to kind of make it work. It was a book I really, really wanted badly. But it was almost 6 months between submitting my proposal and getting offered the book officially. That was one of the toughest, most frustrating 6 months in the world you could imagine, considering I worked on staff and interacted with Danny on an almost daily basis in my job as an advertising manager, and he was an editor. And he was a friend too. We got along. I liked him, and so that made it difficult to continue to have to wait for an answer. On the other hand, it gave me 6 months of thinking about the book. So I had a month to think about it and coming up with my proposal, and then I had another 6 months to think about it before it was even offered to me. So by the time I got that book, I hit the ground running, writing my plots, and I knew so much of what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it. I had 1 or 2 page scenes in my mind that weren't going to happen until issue 18 or 20 or whatever, you know. I think the issue 18 was the cold opening with Night Thrasher in pursuit of Cord, which starts that whole Nothing But the Truth storyline. I had that 2-page sequence in my head from, before I even plotted issue number 1, I had that sequence in my head. So that was really, really good for me. It was a great advantage. I've never actually had that kind of luxury ever since in my career. And I think it showed, because I think the quality of the pacing and the structure of the book, if not necessarily the dialogue or the actual plots themselves, but the pacing and the structure under which the stories unfolded, to this day I'm really proud of those first 25 issues, because I think that I think if you look at them objectively, to remove yourself, it's a really good abject lesson in how to pace and structure an ongoing superhero comic, you know.
I agree. I read it a couple of years ago, and I got through the whole run, and I really enjoyed it. One book I wanted to ask you about, because I didn't get a chance to do it last time, because that was less than ideal circumstances, because my laptop had busted and I lost my notes. You wrote one of the 99-cent books in the mid-90s, the X-Men one, and
I wrote a couple of them. I enjoyed those. I'm cleaning up. I'm cleaning out my basement, and I've just been seeing a whole bunch of the stuff that I'd written, and many of the books I'd even forgotten about. I'm like, what the holy crap! I got a story in this. There were Marvel Comics Presents issues I wrote, stories in, and I swear I'm an idiot. I really am, because I've been doing this for so long, and I had been kind of removed from comics in the last 10 years a lot, but I wrote a story that Dave Cockrum drew, and I totally forgot about it. And I freaking love Dave Cockrum. I loved Dave Cockrum's art when I was a kid. And I wrote several stories that Steve Ditko drew. And at the time, it was Steve Ditko, and he was an artist, and I knew exactly who he was, and I respected the living daylights out of him. But it didn't have the same level of importance back then to me that it does now. I'm 50 now, and I look at that, and I think to myself, holy crap, I got to write a story that Steve Ditko drew. That's pretty freaking cool, because not many people can say that, you know? So yes, I did write. Long story short, I did write a couple of those issues. I think did Jan drew them? I think Jan Drusilla drew them, and Tom Mandrake might have inked them, her husband. I think I wrote issues 3 and 4, 2 and 3.
Yeah, you wrote the issue that did another version of the origin of the Blob, and it was a story that, because I've always, being a fat person, I've always loved the Blob because, the Blob, he doesn't hate himself necessarily, but he relishes in being fat. Mm-hmm. The way you did that story, though, you gave him, you gave him a sad backstory without it being too much. To me, it made him feel like more of a complete person, like you understand how he became the way he was.
Yeah, I enjoyed that issue a lot. In fact, I just saw that in the basement a few weeks ago when I was cleaning up. I saw that one, and then the other one was a Quicksilver Scarlet Witch focused story. I love that 99-cent book. I really wish I could have written a lot more of them. I would have loved to have written that book monthly. I love going back like Kurt Busiek did with Untold Tales of Spider-Man, going back and doing spackle stuff and filling in things between issues and between panels and cleaning stuff up that got changed or contradicted later. I really like that kind of stuff. I like revisiting those older stories with what at that time it was a more modern sensibility. I think those kinds of stories were better handled then in the late 80s and 90s, quite frankly, than they are now, because I think the generation of writers right now are so far removed from the original content that they only read about it in reprints 20 years later, as opposed to actually having read the original stuff or having read the first generation reprints that happened in annuals and king size issues back in the late 60s and early 70s. And I think the further you remove yourself from the feeling, the memory of what it was like to read the material as a kid, then the less emotional attachment you have to it, and often that means the less respect you have for it. So I'm almost like the last generation that can write about the 60s and 70s because we actually read them when they came out as kids, as opposed to the guys who are writing now who are in their 30s, or even early 40s. They were too young to have read comics until the late 70s, So anyway, that's why I really, really enjoy those kinds of books, and I did enjoy those two issues quite a bit.
Yeah, I read the original one. I was able to get it a few years later when they did the first essential original X-Men, and the thing I remember was, man, the X-Men were being jerks to the Blob. I mean, I'm not saying the Blob was... Yeah, he wasn't.
No, the Blob's a jerk too, but the X-Men were pretty. The X-Men were pretty rude to him. I find it ironic that of all my X-Men work, I probably enjoyed the single issues far, far more than I did writing the X-Men book itself. Like the X-Men Unlimited issues that I did, I think I did like issue 2 and issue 4. I did a Sabretooth one-shot special. I enjoyed those a lot more. I enjoyed a lot of that stuff. I enjoyed writing X-Men Unlimited number 2, the Magneto story. I enjoyed writing the Sabretooth stuff that I did a lot. I felt I got a chance to do a lot more interesting work with the one-offs than I did with the main book.
Going back to New Warriors a second, eventually New Warriors was popular enough that it eventually was able to get 2 spinoffs. Nova was able to get his own series again, and Night Thrasher got his own series. Now, I think you wrote the Night Thrasher series initially, didn't you?
Yeah, I wrote both of them initially. I wrote the Nova. There was a Night Thrasher miniseries. I wrote that sold well enough to justify a monthly series. Unfortunately, what happened, I was getting stretched too thin at that point. I had wanted to expand the Warriors franchise. It probably should have started after issue 25, and it didn't start until the Warriors was up to issue 40-something when the spin-off started happening, I think it was. That was a mistake because I think sales had reached a bit of a height and they were starting to come down. So as Marvel was trying to do more and more in their publishing program to make up for some of the losses in sales they were starting to see, that was the wrong time to expand the franchise. So I always had a plan in mind to expand the franchise. I wanted there to be 2 monthly Warrior books. I wanted there to be a Night Thrasher monthly and a Nova monthly. But by the time we got to start doing it, it was kind of too late, and we probably shouldn't have. My whole storyline leading up to issue 50 of New Warriors was basically to launch a second book, which by the time I wrote the story, I knew we weren't going to launch a second book. So the goal was to have two different teams, almost like the Teen Titans was trying to do and the Avengers was doing and X-Men was doing. So I wrote the first 7 or 8 issues of Night Thrasher and the first 6 or 7 issues of Nova, and then I had to step back. And by that point, I was already planning to leave New Warriors anyway. Regretfully, I knew that I had to, so I knew that the expiration date, the clock was ticking for me. So I enjoyed writing those books. I enjoyed working with Chris Marion on Nova a lot. He really surprised me, and I thought he did a really nice job on the book. But it wasn't work I was going to be able to do for too long.
How would you do it now? Because I was curious about Night Thrasher. How did you? Because I apologize, I haven't read these. I haven't read the Night Thrasher issues in a long time. How would you approach a Night Thrasher book in a way that you would in New Warriors? Because I remember John Byrne was talking about when he was writing Marvel 2-in-1 or the Thing solo book, and he said the problem with writing the Thing was that it was hard to do a Thing solo story that's not a Fantastic Four story.
Yeah, and I get that, and I get John saying that, and absolutely, and I would agree with him. I think that Night Thrasher is a very different character than the Thing. I think that the Thing is dependent on playing off of other people. That's why he works so well in the FF, and that's quite frankly why he often worked really well in Marvel 2-in-1, depending on who was writing him and who his guest star was. The Thing is a family member. Dwayne Night Thrasher was a character in search of a family who was used to being a loner most of his life. So I could tell solo stories that were stories of him trying to find his way through situations. And if you look at the monthly series that I did, almost everything was a little bit of an example of him trying to find his way through a situation. A hijacking of a plane, a breakup with a girlfriend, a race riot in Manhattan. Everything was him not being necessarily a proactive hero or the master strategist manipulator like I had him be in the monthly Warriors book. It was really more about him reacting to things so that I can get into his emotions and his character in a different way than I would have in a monthly book for the New Warriors. Conversely, Nova was kind of the same thing too, almost the opposite though. In the monthly Nova book, in the New Warriors book, Nova had to often wait for the okay to act because he was in a group setting and he wasn't a team leader and he had been coming from a place of insecurity that when he started in New Warriors and all that stuff. But in the monthly Nova book, it was full speed ahead. You have carte blanche to act because you're solo. So it was really a human rocket. He could go and seek out trouble and crime and problems and attack it. So their monthly books were easy to write because it allowed the characters to be able to act a little bit, not act differently, but have to be placed in situations that were different than the kinds of situations they were placed in New Warriors.
All right, okay, go into another thing, because I'm trying to cover a lot of ground here. On your Thunderbolts run, when you came back, you used some villains like Joystick and Speed Demon, and you've also used the Constrictor a lot in various books. How do you come to choose villains like that, or even the Light Master in the Cable and Deadpool arc? What draws you to some of these villains?
The reasons always vary, honestly. There are some characters you just like, or there are characters that you have been shown to mix in interesting ways with other characters, like Constrictor. I didn't choose Joystick for the Thunderbolts. In fact, I let Kurt pick some of the new characters because I didn't want... I had done so much of that already over the last several years of writing Thunderbolts that I wanted him to think about it, come up with some interesting ideas that I wouldn't have thought of, drop them on my lap and make me have to work with them. And that's how I wanted to do it. So he was the one who picked Joystick because he thought that was a really interesting character with a fun backstory and premise. And it took me a little while to figure her out, but I got some mileage out of her once I did figure her out. So you can tell to the way Kurt thinks, he picked Radioactive Man. I probably never would have picked Radioactive Man in a million years because he wears a skirt. You know what I mean? And Kurt's way of writing is, no, I want to write him because he wears a skirt. And my method of writing is, I don't want to write him because he wears a skirt. So it was a lot of fun as a result of that. And I enjoyed working on the new Thunderbolts book because it got to be a bit of a different creature. It was a different beast than it was the first time around, and Tom Grummett is a different artist than Pat Zirker or Mark Bagley are. So I did enjoy it. I liked the difference in how the book was structured. I missed Baron Zemo because I thought he was so integral to the book, but I thought it was still okay to make it work without him, you know?
Yeah, one thing you did later on with the Deeper Well storyline, not the Deeper Well, the Spring Well of Power, because I think that was the same well that was in the New Warrior story arc.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Okay. You did a really interesting bit with Dr. Octopus, and again, it was just one line because it's basically the supervillains are trying to work as, to help these people, and someone asked Dr. Octopus if they should retreat, and Dr. Octopus seems like he's actually agonizing over the decision. Like, to me, it seemed like he gave him just a little more depth as a person.
Well, I don't remember the exact details of the moment, although I do remember the Civil War issues that had all the villains kind of being forced to fight, the good fight, as it were. I see Dr. Octopus, always saw him as an incredibly intelligent man whose only circumstances for having become a villain was his own insecurity and his own inability to get past that whole Spider-Man thing, So my attitude with a character like Dr. Octopus is if you take him out of the Spider-Man book and you put him in a position where he is expected to be responsible, he is respected for being intelligent, then he will rise to the occasion and shine because he's a brilliant man. You know what I mean? He's a brilliant man with an incredible ego and a massive sense of insecurity about him. So if you massage his ego, if you make him feel secure, and if you say, we need your help, then his arrogance says, I'm here to help you. And he does it because he can. You know what I mean? I think what Dan's doing with Superior Spider-Man right now is phenomenal. I think it's fantastic, and I love it because part of it is what I just told you. My approach or my thinking on characters like Dr. Octopus. He's manifesting it now in a monthly book where Doc Ock is Spider-Man, and you get to see the difference in how Spider-Man acts when he's got Doc Ock's brain in the body. Yeah,
because that was actually what made me think of it. And again, I haven't had a chance to really ask about X-Force, and that's mostly my fault just because that wasn't really one of the books I read over the years. But can you tell me, how was it working with Rob Liefeld as a collaborator?
I think it was always an interesting, fun, frustrating, challenging, exciting time. I mean, Rob is a whirling dervish. Rob was like the Tasmanian devil of artists. He was spinning frantically, coming up with a gajillion ideas, doing some really fun, cool pages of art that exhausted him, and then he'd hand in pages that were not as fleshed out, or he'd have assistants doing a whole bunch of work. So what you got from him was very, very inconsistent, which made it really frustrating to work with him. But that being said, there was a level of excitement about the work, and there was a level of enthusiasm among younger readers for his work. You know, he's criticized left and right nowadays, and he was criticized by a lot of people back then, too. But I guarantee you, I know who wasn't criticizing Rob very much. That was all the 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds that were scarfing up those books and waiting in line for hours to get autographs, because I saw them firsthand on a month-in, month-out basis. So the book was selling to a different demographic than what X-Men was selling to, and quite frankly, a much-needed demographic. So the truth is that it's Charles Dickens. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was a really fun roller coaster ride, but any roller coaster ride has ups and downs. Okay, and there were ups and downs.
Yeah, I was actually telling Neil, he's my co-host, he hasn't really spoke up here, you know, but I look at it now, and I can still see a lot of energy and enthusiasm in it, and there are things that I can't quite explain it, how it appeals to me, but it's like there's an inner kid, and again, I was about that age when these books came out. I just didn't see them because I didn't start reading comics. You know, I was always like 5 years behind on comics. Mm-hmm. You know, I think I was about 11 or 12 then, you know, but there's something about it that's appealing.
Yeah, there is. Listen, there was a dynamic energy to his panel compositions and his figure drawing that was it anatomically perfect or correct all the time? No. Did he skimp or cheat on backgrounds? Yes. Did he not maintain a consistency of where he was setting his characters so that details in a room would change from panel to panel? Yes. Some of that was because he was doing on purpose too, and some of it was because he had assistants helping him to meet the monthly schedule. So there was a little bit of everything going on, but there absolutely was a tangible sense of energy to his work, not just his penciling, but his panel layouts, his covers, and also the coloring. He had a big hand in the coloring. And if you look back on the coloring of some of those X-Force issues, you'll see the beginning, the inklings of what would end up becoming the more sophisticated computer coloring, where he was trying to do things with color that, quite frankly, the medium couldn't support back then because of the printing process. But his use of color was trying to wash it in strong primary bold colors, set entire scenes like in red alert chambers where flashing red lights were casting deep reds and pinks all over the place to try to simulate what a movie would do with neon, you know? So he was trying all kinds of interesting stuff, and he may not have had the skill at the time, at that age, and the printing process may not have had the technological ability to do it, but the passion and the interest in doing it was there.
So anyway, the Deadpool issues list you as the creator, and again, you had a big hand in Cable's early years. When you came back to Marvel, or at least working on Deadpool and Cable full time, how much had those characters changed since you left them?
Barely at all. I didn't co-create Cable. I co-created Deadpool. Right. I was responsible for seminal aspects of Cable's origins, obviously, without Rob's presence, because Rob had already left for Image at that point. But when I came back to do Cable and Deadpool, the truth of the matter is that when I got offered that book, I hadn't worked for Marvel for 6 months, and I thought I wasn't going to get a chance to. And apparently they had a meeting at the office, and they talked about trying to figure out a way to salvage Cable and Deadpool because they tried those disastrous Soldier X and Agent X series that really did not do well at all. And they were trying to figure out a way to salvage those two characters. And I think from the story I was told is that Bill Jemas in a meeting said, well, who knows these characters? And someone in the meeting said, well, Fabian co-created Deadpool, and he wrote more Cable than anybody else. And Jemas said, okay, so call him. And Mike Martz called me up, who was the editor at the time, and said, "You think a book with these two guys in it could work on a monthly basis?" And my brain was saying, "No fucking way." And my mouth said, "Absolutely, yeah." because I hadn't worked for Marvel for 6 months and I wanted another book. And it was funny. Mike said, "All right, let's work something up. Work out a 6-issue outline." You know, the Gemus is all into these trade paperback flows, so he doesn't want the two characters meeting until the 6th issue, but that seems too late to me. Let's try to get him to hook up by the end of the 1st issue. And so I said, okay, so I broke down a 6-issue outline, and the minute I started working on that outline, I said, this book could work. This book is The Odd Couple, and this book could work. And I think it did for the most part. Month in and month out, I think the book worked really, really well. I wish it had sold better, but in my mind, I salvaged both those characters from the scrap heap. If I had failed with that book, those two characters might have been put on the shelf for five years, you know? But the truth of the matter is I salvaged both of those characters, and I solidified them so that the next editorial regime could boot me off the book and do something with both characters, which is exactly what they've done in the last 5 years, you know, without me. But if it weren't for what I did on that book, I don't know if you'd be reading a Deadpool book right now, or I don't know if you'd be seeing Cable and Marvel Comics right now. You know, it would have taken a while for them to come back.
Let me ask something, because, you know, and again, from an outsider's point of view, it seems, I sometimes, you know, because I remember I was a diehard Thunderbolts fan, you know, and I wasn't up until New Thunderbolts, and I thought, you know, the way you were, I don't know how to say this, but it feels like Marvel's kind of treated you crappy at times.
Yeah, I've been treated crappy by Marvel at times, absolutely, but it's not the company treating me crappily, because the company can't do that. It's individuals within the company. But that's just the ebb and flow of the way it works. I mean, that's really what it is. Different editorial regimes take power. Different generations of editors want to hire their own writers. They don't want to hire the old guard, or they don't want to let the old guard do something new, or the old guard tries to do something new and it doesn't work, and they're considered persona non grata. I mean, listen, it's been this way forever. It's no different. When I was in my 20s working at Marvel, I saw a lot of the guys from the 70s getting phased out. You know, and now that I've been doing this for 25 years, I've been phased out to a certain extent, almost completely, and it frustrates you, because I think inside, you know, creatively, you still have the goods. I think I'm a better writer now than I ever was, and I think, like, given the right book with the right editor at the right time, there's nothing I can't write for either company, you know. But if the companies don't feel that way, what are you going to do about it? If the editors don't feel that way, what can you do? I'm like, you know, there's other things I do to make a living and that I enjoy. So would I like to write a book for Marvel or DC? Depending on the book, depending on the editor, I would love to, you know, but I'm not exactly fretting about it on a daily basis. I'm not bothering editors on a daily basis, because I saw writers who did that and it never worked. So I'm 180 degrees the opposite direction. I got other stuff I do that make me a good living and keep me very, very interested in my work. And it has almost nothing to do with comics. Sometimes it does have quite a lot to do with comics, but not necessarily with the comic book companies.
And this is a question I've had since last time, you know, because you mentioned going to L.A. to meet with Mattel. Doing a Barbie comic, exactly what does Mattel expect?
We don't even have the time to cover what that was like. That's a chapter in a book all itself. The licensing business of publishing licensed comics is such a hit and miss, and it's so dependent on striking a deal with a licensor that understands the nature of publishing. And like Ren and Stimpy was a huge success because Nickelodeon understood the nature of publishing and let us tell good comic book stories about their Ren and Stimpy characters. That was a monthly fight in and of itself, too, because they weren't letting us do in the comics the very things they were doing in the cartoon, because they had no control over John Cristofalusi and his insanity, but they had some semblance of control over us as a publishing licensee, you know? And you argue and you compromise that when a book is selling as well as Ren and Stimpy was, you can get away with figuring out the good middle ground, you know? And it also, you form relationships with the licensing people, too. So I worked on a monthly basis with the same contact woman from Nickelodeon, and she was a wonderful, wonderful woman, and we got along well. And you know, they say, you can't do this fart thing, you can't do the bubbles in the bathtub. I said, what are you talking about? You just did that on a cartoon. I know, I'm sorry, but they told me we can't do it. Okay, fine. So Dan Slotler and throw 5 things in there, and they're not going to let you do 3. So you throw 3 really bad things in there, knowing they're going to say no to those, so that the 2 less bad things, which are the 2 you wanted to begin with, are the ones they approve, you know? And working for Barbie, working for Mattel was just the strangest thing ever. They licensed Barbie without having a clue what that would mean in a monthly published comic book. And I assumed editorship over that property after Sid Jacobson had tried for almost a year. And Sid Jacobson was a legendary comic book editor, okay? He had tried for almost a year to get something that Mattel would approve and understand. And here I am, a brand new editor. You know, still I was 30 or 31 at the time, and I'm responsible for trying to figure out how we're going to make Mattel understand how to make Barbie work. And I spent a couple months. I got all new creative people. I literally had to fly out to L.A. and do comic book 101 lessons to them, because they were telling me, can't you just photocopy the black and white drawings of Barbie from the style guide and put them in different panels? I was like, you have 14 Barbie drawings in your style guide. A comic book is 22 pages with 5 to 6 panels per page every single month. You're going to exhaust your Barbie style guide drawings by page 3 of your first issue. So Barbie had never had a voice before. It was always the little girl's voice, not us telling them who she was. She'd never had a character before, because it was the little girl imposing the character on the girl. And we're trying to tell stories of this character, Barbie. So I taught an entire licensing division at Mattel about what we were going to do, how we were going to do it. They finally started approving the writing. They finally started approving the art. And almost the entire licensing regime got fired. So I had, by the time issues 3s and 4s of the 2 Barbie books were coming out, I had to do the whole thing all over again in L.A. with a whole new licensing department, like 12 new people in a room going to me, can't you just photocopy the drawings from the style guide? And I'm going through the whole thing again, okay? The book was not the success it should have been, and that was mostly Marvel's fault. It was our #1 subscription title for like 2 years. It had like 35,000 subs, but it didn't sell on the newsstand the way it should have, because girls weren't going to the spinner rack, and the direct market never touched it because estrogen was not allowed in comic book shops back then. So the book never succeeded on a sales basis, but it succeeded on a qualitative basis for sure. And it's set in motion.
You only got less than a minute.